The Kepler 442 orbital station hung in the darkness of space like a silver coin spinning against black velvet. And Commander Elena Vasquez stood at the observation deck watching 3 Valorian warships move into position outside the station's defensive perimeter. She had seen many things in her 40 years of life, but nothing quite like the ships of the hegemony. And their vessels looked like giant insects made of metal and light, with sharp angles and glowing weapons that pulsed with barely contained energy. "Commander, the delegation has arrived at Docking Bay 7, said Lieutenant Park through her earpiece. And Vasquez took a deep breath before turning away from the window. The Valorian hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and they had done so through a simple formula of superior numbers, advanced technology, an absolute certainty that no species could challenge their authority. Humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, barely a century into interstellar travel, and the hegemony viewed them the same way a lion might view a mouse that had wandered into its territory. Vasquez walked through the station's corridors with measured steps, her boots clicking against the metal floor, and she passed dozens of humans going about their daily business. Engineers and traders and families who had made this station their home. The delegation waited in the main conference room, and Ambassador Dexal stood at the center of his entourage like a king surrounded by knights, his blue-scaled skin shimmering under the artificial lights. Dexal was tall and thin, with 4 arms and eyes that reflected no warmth, and he looked at Vasquez the way one might look at an insect that had crawled onto the dinner table. "Commander Vasquez," he said, his voice translated through a device on his collar. "I bring words from the High Council of the Valorian hegemony." Vasquez nodded and gestured for him to continue, keeping her face neutral, even as her heart beat faster in her chest. "Your species has expanded beyond its designated boundaries," Dexal announced, and his words fell like stones into still water. "You have established colonies in 3 systems that belong to the hegemony by right of ancient claim." The room went silent, and Vasquez could feel the tension rising like heat from a fire. "We were not informed of any claims to those systems," she replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "Our survey showed them to be uninhabited and unclaimed." Dexal made a sound that might have been laughter, but it held no humor, only contempt. "Your surveys mean nothing," he said. "The hegemony does not recognize the claims of primitive species, and you will withdraw from those colonies within 30 standard days or face corrective action." Vasquez felt her jaw tighten, but before she could respond, the doors to the conference room burst open and chaos erupted. A figure in dark clothing rushed toward Dexal with a weapon raised, and the ambassador's guards moved to intercept, but they were too slow, too far away, and the assassin was already taking aim. What happened next would be talked about across the galaxy for generations to come. Maria Santos was 63 years old, and she had worked in the station's cafeteria for the past 8 years, making soup and serving meals to anyone who walked through her doors. And she had been delivering refreshments to the conference room when the assassin appeared. Maria had grown up in rural Brazil, in a small village where hunting wild boar was not a sport but a necessity, and her father had taught her to throw a knife before she could read. And her aim had been perfect since she was 10 years old. She did not think about what she was doing, because thinking would have taken too long, and instead she simply acted, picking up the fork from the tray she carried and throwing it with all the skill her father had given her. The fork crossed the room in less than a heartbeat, spinning end over end with terrible precision, and it struck the assassin in the eye with enough force to penetrate his brain. And he was dead before he hit the ground. Silence fell over the room like a blanket, and everyone stared at the dead assassin and then at Maria, who stood there with her tray still balanced on one hand, looking almost embarrassed by the attention. Dexal's guards finally reached their ambassador and surrounded him with weapons drawn. their eyes scanning the room for more threats, but there were none. Only a dead assassin and a cafeteria worker who had just saved the ambassador's life. What just happened? Exal demanded, his composure cracking for the first time. Who threw that weapon? Vasquez looked at Maria, and Maria looked back at her with a small shrug that said more than words ever could. That would be Maria, Vasquez said, and she could not quite hide the smile that tugged at her lips. She makes the soup. The Exol stared at Maria as if she had grown a second head, and his guards exchanged glances that spoke of confusion and something that might have been fear. She is one of your soldiers, the Exol said, but it was more of a question than a statement. A trained warrior disguised as a servant, Vasquez shook her head, and her smile grew wider. Maria retired from her village in Brazil 12 years ago, she explained. She came here because her daughter works in engineering, and she did not want to be far from her grandchildren. But the throw, one of the guards said, his voice trembling slightly, the precision, the speed. It was impossible, Maria finally spoke, her voice carrying the warm accent of her homeland. And she sounded more concerned about the spilled drinks on her tray than about the life she had just taken. My father taught me, she said simply. We hunted boar in the mountains, and if you missed, the boar did not give you a second chance. The Exol looked at the dead assassin, then at Maria, and then at Vasquez, and something changed in his eyes. Something that looked almost like uncertainty. This changes nothing, he said. But his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The ultimatum stands, and your species will comply or face the consequences. He turned and walked toward the door, his guards forming a protective circle around him. But he stopped at the threshold and looked back one more time. The assassin was not one of ours, he added, and his words hung in the air with unspoken implications. Someone wanted this meeting to end in blood. After the delegation left, Vasquez stood alone with Maria in the conference room, looking at the body that security would soon remove. Thank you, Vasquez said. You saved his life. Even though he came here to threaten us. Maria nodded and bent down to pick up the fallen glasses from her tray, her movements calm and unhurried. My mother always said that food should bring people together, not tear them apart, Maria replied. But she also said that some people need to be reminded that the cook is not to be underestimated. Vasquez laughed. And for a moment, the weight of the ultimatum felt a little lighter. She did not know it yet. But that thrown fork would change everything. And the galaxy would soon learn what every boar in the Brazilian mountains had learned generations ago. Humans do not miss. Intelligence Officer Kethra had served the hegemony for 200 years. And in all that time, she had never encountered a mystery she could not solve, but the humans were different. And they made her afraid in ways she could not explain. She sat in her office on the hegemony's central intelligence station, surrounded by screens that displayed information from 1,000 different sources. And she watched the footage from Kepler Station for the 100th time. The fork left the human female's hand with perfect precision, traveling across the room in a straight line that defied probability. And it struck the assassin exactly where it needed to strike to kill him instantly, slowed the footage down to 1,000th of normal speed. And she watched the human's arm move through the throwing motion with mechanical precision, every muscle working in perfect harmony. How is this possible? She whispered to herself. And the question haunted her like a ghost that refused to leave her assistant. A young officer named Vethal entered the room with a collection of data tablets in his arms, and he looked almost as troubled as she felt. I have gathered everything we have on human biology and culture, he said, placing the tablets on her desk. But I warn you, Officer Kethra, the information is disturbing. Kethra picked up the first tablet and began to read. And with every word, her sense of unease grew deeper. The human homeworld was a nightmare given form. a planet of crushing gravity where everything wanted to kill you. And the humans had not just survived there. They had thrived. Earth's gravity was nearly twice the galactic average. And this meant that humans had evolved with dense bones and powerful muscles just to walk from one place to another. And their bodies were designed for endurance and strength in ways that seemed almost unfair. But it was the history that truly frightened Kethra, because humans had spent their entire existence as predators, hunting creatures across vast distances, using nothing but their own bodies and simple projectile weapons. She found records of ancient humans running after prey for days at a time, never stopping, never resting, until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. And then the humans would throw their spears with deadly accuracy to finish the kill. This method of hunting was called persistence hunting, and it required two things that humans possessed in abundance: the endurance to run forever and the ability to throw objects with lethal precision. Keth moved to the next tablet and found records of human cultural practices. And what she saw there made her scales turn pale. Humans practiced accuracy for recreation, and they did so constantly, obsessively. From the moment they could walk, she watched videos of human children throwing balls at hoops suspended in the air, and they did this for hours every day. Training their bodies to calculate distance and trajectory and force without conscious thought. She saw footage of humans throwing small pointed objects at circular targets on walls, and they called this game darts, and even their entertainment was designed to improve their ability to hit targets. There were competitions where humans threw balls at each other with incredible speed and accuracy, and the best throwers were celebrated as heroes and paid fortunes for their abilities. She found records of human weapons development, and the progression made her shudder with fear, because humans had spent their entire history improving their ability to hit targets at greater and greater distances. They started with thrown rocks and spears, then moved to devices that used mechanical advantage to throw smaller projectiles faster and farther. And eventually, they developed weapons that could hit targets from distances so great that the curvature of their planet had to be calculated into the shot. They did not just use these weapons for war. They used them for sport, and millions of humans competed to see who could hit targets with the greatest precision. Kethra found footage of something called the Olympic Games, where humans from around their world gathered to compete in feats of accuracy. And she watched in horror as they hit targets that should have been impossible to hit. One competition involved humans skiing across snow while stopping periodically to shoot at tiny targets with rifles. And they did this with heart rates elevated from physical exertion, which should have made accurate shooting impossible. But they hit their targets anyways. She watched archers split arrows that had already struck the center of the target, and she saw shooters hit coins thrown into the air, and she saw athletes throw spears and discs with precision that defied belief. "Vethal," she said, a voice barely above a whisper. "Do you understand what we are seeing?" Her assistant nodded, and his expression was grim. "Every human is a natural marksman," he replied. "They are born with bodies designed for throwing, and they spend their entire lives practicing accuracy. And they do not even realize how remarkable this is, because they think everyone in the galaxy can do the same." Kethra set down the tablet and stared at the wall for a long moment, trying to process what she had learned. The hegemony had conquered 12 species across 3,000 years, and they had done so because those species could not match the hegemony's military, technology, and training. But technology could be learned and training could be given, and the humans were already acquiring both at an alarming rate. And when they combined their natural abilities with proper weapons and tactics, they would become something the galaxy had never seen before. "I need to present a report to the High Council," Kethra said, and she began to compose her findings in her mind. The report she delivered 3 days later was comprehensive and terrifying, and it laid out in precise detail why humanity represented an existential threat to hegemony dominance. Every human is a potential sniper, she told the council, her voice steady despite her fear. Their civilians practice accuracy as entertainment, and their children play games of precision before they can read, and their elderly retain throwing abilities that would make our best soldiers weep with envy. The council listened, and some of them seemed troubled by her words. But the High Admiral dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. They are primitives, he said. They have barely left their own system, and their fleet is tiny compared to ours. And no amount of throwing ability can stop orbital bombardment. Kethra tried to argue, but the council had already made up their minds, and they authorized the invasion of the human colonies without further debate. As she left the council chamber, Kethra felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. The certainty that she was watching her civilization make a terrible mistake. She was right. The invasion force launched 2 weeks later, and the hegemony expected victory within hours. And they were wrong in ways they could not imagine, because humans do not miss. And they had been preparing for this moment since the first cave. Dweller picked up a rock and threw it at something that needed to die. The hegemony invasion force arrived at Nova Helsinki with 50,000 soldiers and complete confidence in their victory. And they expected the human colony to fall within hours because there was no military garrison. Only miners and farmers and engineers and their families. They were so very wrong. General Krethox commanded the invasion force, and he had conquered 6 worlds in his long career. And he had never faced an enemy he could not crush. And he fully expected this operation to be a simple exercise in demonstrating hegemony power. The colony of Nova Helsinki sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, and it was home to 200,000 humans who had come to this world to mine valuable minerals and build new lives far from the crowded cities of Earth. When the hegemony ships appeared in orbit, the colonists did not panic, because panic was not in their nature. And instead they did what humans have always done when threatened. They prepared to fight Governor Elena. Korhanen was a former mining engineer who had spent 30 years building things. And now she would spend the next 3 weeks tearing things down. And she organized the defense with the same practical efficiency she had used to build the colony. We have no military weapons, her security chief reported. Only hunting rifles and mining equipment. Governor Korhanen smiled. And it was not a pleasant smile. Then we will use what we have, she replied. And we will show them what humans can do with rocks and determination. The first hegemony troops landed in the southern fields, expecting minimal resistance, and they advanced toward the colony in perfect formation, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. They never saw the ambush coming. Jackson Cole had been a professional baseball pitcher 30 years ago, and his fastball had been clocked at over 100 miles per hour, and age had slowed him down only slightly. And he still had the arm that had made him famous. He stood on a ridge overlooking the advancing troops, and in his hands he held a bag of mining bolts, small metal projectiles used for marking rock faces. He threw the first bolt with all the power his arm could muster, and it crossed the distance in a heartbeat and struck a hegemony officer in the gap between his helmet and his armor. And the officer dropped without a sound before the troops could react. More bolts flew from hidden positions along the ridge, each one thrown by a human who had spent a lifetime practicing accuracy. And 7 officers fell in the first 10 seconds. The hegemony soldiers opened fire on the ridge, but the humans were already gone, melting into the rocks like ghosts. General Krethox received the report of the ambush with disbelief, and he ordered his forces to advance more carefully. But careful did not help against an enemy that could strike from anywhere. The second day brought more casualties, and the third day brought even more. And by the end of the first week, the hegemony had lost 5,000 soldiers without ever engaging the human defenders in direct combat. The humans fought like shadows, appearing from nowhere to launch devastating attacks and then vanishing before the hegemony could respond. And every attack was marked by impossible accuracy. Rocks thrown from hidden positions, cracked helmets, and shattered visors. And improvised crossbows punched through armor at ranges that should have been impossible. And mining lasers modified for combat cut through vehicles with surgical precision. Commander Vasquez arrived with a small relief force on the 8th day, and she found a colony that had transformed itself into a fortress of ingenuity and determination. "How many trained soldiers do you have?" she asked Governor Korhanen. The governor laughed and gestured at the people around her. Miners covered in dust and farmers with calloused hands and engineers who had not slept in days. "None," she replied. "But we have something better. We have people who grew up throwing things and hitting what they aimed at." Vasquez watched a 12-year-old girl named Yuki practicing with a hunting rifle. And the girl hit the center of her target 5 times in a row without missing once. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Vasquez asked. Yuki shrugged, as if the question made no sense. "My grandfather taught me," she said. "He said every human should know how to hit what they aim at, because you never know when it might matter." The hegemony brought in their sharpshooter corps on the 15th day. Elite soldiers who had been genetically enhanced for accuracy and had trained their entire lives to be the best marksmen in the galaxy. They expected to dominate the battlefield and break the human resistance once and for all. Anders Lindquist was 71 years old, and he sat in a position his grandchildren had built for him. A reinforced bunker with a perfect view of the valley below. And in his hands he held a rifle that his great-grandfather had brought from Earth. Anders had won 3 Olympic gold medals in biathlon 50 years ago. And age had taken his legs, but not his eyes and not his steady hands. And he had been waiting for this moment since the invasion began. The hegemony sharpshooters advanced into the valley with confidence, their enhanced eyes scanning for targets, their weapons ready to eliminate any resistance. Anders took a breath and let it out slowly. And then he began to fire. The first sharpshooter fell with a bullet through his eye, and the second fell before the first hit the ground. And the third and fourth and fifth fell in rapid succession, each one killed with a single perfectly placed shot. The remaining sharpshooters tried to locate the source of the fire, but Anders was already moving to his secondary position, his grandchildren carrying his wheelchair through tunnels they had dug specifically for this purpose. By the end of the day, the hegemony sharpshooter corps had been reduced by half, and not a single one of them had managed to hit Anders or any other human defender. General Krethox stood in his command center and stared at the casualty reports. And for the first time in his long career, he felt something that might have been fear. His communications officer approached with a request from the human commander, and Krethox accepted the transmission with the weariness of a defeated man. Commander Vasquez appeared on his screen, and she was smiling, and her smile was more terrifying than any weapon. "General," she said, "I have a question for you." Krethox waited, and the weight of his failure pressed down on him like a physical force. "Which human is your sniper?" Vasquez asked, and her smile grew wider. "Because I want you to know something important. Every single one of these civilians can do what Anders just did. And he is 71 years old and fights from a wheelchair." The general said nothing, because there was nothing to say. "Pick any civilian," Vasquez continued. "Go ahead. Choose anyone, the farmer or the miner or the child or the grandmother. It does not matter which one you pick, because they all grew up throwing things and hitting what they aimed at." She leaned closer to the camera, and her voice dropped to something cold and hard. "They do not miss, General, and neither do I. So I suggest you take your remaining soldiers and leave this world before there are none of them left to leave." General Krethox ordered the retreat the next morning, and the hegemony left Nova Helsinki with fewer than half the soldiers they had arrived with. The humans watched them go. And then they went back to mining and farming and building, because that was what they had come to this world to do. And no alien invasion was going to stop them from living their lives. But they kept their rifles clean and their throwing arms strong, because they had learned something important during those 3 weeks of fighting. The galaxy was not as safe as they had believed, and humans would need to be ready for whatever came next. The news of Nova Helsinki spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass, and no amount of hegemony propaganda could suppress the truth, because the numbers were simply too impossible to hide 50,000 elite hegemony. Soldiers had been defeated by 200,000 civilians armed with hunting rifles and rocks and improvised weapons. And the galaxy had never seen anything like it on the hegemony throne world. The High Council convened an emergency session, and for the first time in 3,000 years, they faced a crisis they did not know how to solve. Intelligence Officer Kethra stood before them once again, and this time they listened to every word she said. "I warned you," she said, and there was no satisfaction in her voice, only exhaustion and fear. "I told you what humans were capable of, and you did not believe me. And now 25,000 of our soldiers are dead because of that disbelief." The High Admiral, who had dismissed her report, sat in silence, his earlier confidence shattered by the reality of what had happened on Nova Helsinki. "What do you recommend?" the council speaker asked, and his voice carried the weight of a civilization facing an uncertain future. Rekithra had prepared for this question, and her answer was not what they wanted to hear. "We must sue for peace," she said. "We must recognize humanity as equals and abandon any plans for conquest. Because if we continue this war, we will lose more than soldiers. We will lose everything we have built." The council erupted in outrage, and voices shouted denials and demands for revenge. But Kethra stood firm against the storm. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "The humans have barely begun to fight, and they fought Nova Helsinki with hunting weapons and improvised tools, and they still defeated our best soldiers." She activated a display that showed human weapons development over the centuries. The steady progression from spears to bows to firearms to missiles when they bring their real weapons to bear, she continued. When they combine their natural abilities with proper military technology, there will be nothing in the galaxy that can stop them. The council fell silent, and in that silence, seeds of fear began to grow. But it was not only the hegemony that watched and learned from Nova Helsinki on a dozen worlds across the galaxy. Species that had lived under hegemony rule for centuries saw something they had never seen before, proof that the hegemony could be defeated. The insectoid Krix had been conquered 800 years ago, and they had lived as servants and laborers ever since. Their population controlled, their culture suppressed, their spirit nearly broken. But when they watched the footage of human farmers throwing rocks with lethal accuracy, something stirred in their collective consciousness, something that had been dormant for centuries. A Krix delegation traveled to Earth in secret, their ship disguised as a merchant vessel, and they requested a meeting with human leaders. "Teach us," their leader said, standing before the United Nations Assembly. "Teach us to fight as you fight. Teach us to throw as you throw. Teach us to be free." The debate that followed would shape the future of human civilization. Some argued for peace at any cost, for accommodation with the hegemony, for a quiet existence on the edges of galactic society. Others recognized the truth. The hegemony would never allow humanity to exist as equals, not after the humiliation of Nova Helsinki. And the only path forward was to prepare for the war that was coming. A compromise emerged from the debate, crafted by diplomats and soldiers and ordinary citizens who understood that humanity could not hide from its destiny. Earth would not seek war, but it would not flee from war either, and most importantly, it would share its knowledge with anyone who asked for help. Commander Vasquez received her promotion to Admiral on a Tuesday afternoon, in a ceremony that was broadcast across human space. And she stood before the gathered crowd and spoke words that would echo across the galaxy. "We did not ask to be warriors," she said. "We came to the stars to explore and trade and build new lives. But we have learned that some will only respect strength. And so we will be strong." She paused, and her eyes swept across the faces before her. "Civilians and soldiers alike. But our strength will not be measured only in weapons and warships," she continued. "It will be measured in the friends we make, in the knowledge we share, in the chains we help break." The Crix delegation sat in the front row, and their compound eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. Though Crix did not cry in the same way humans did. Any species that wants to learn to fight for their freedom will find teachers among humanity, Admiral Vasquez declared. Any people that refuse to bow before tyrants will find allies in us. And together we will build a galaxy where no one has to live in fear. The applause that followed shook the walls of the assembly hall, and across human space, people cheered for a future that suddenly seemed possible. But the hegemony was not idle during these months of change. Deep in their most secure research facilities, scientists worked on a weapon that would end the human threat once and for all. A planet killer capable of destroying Earth itself from beyond the reach of any defense intelligence officer. Kethra learned of this weapon through sources she had cultivated over decades of service. And she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could remain loyal to the hegemony and watch as billions of humans were murdered. Or she could betray everything she had ever known and try to prevent the greatest atrocity in galactic history. The choice, in the end, was not difficult at all. She stole the weapon plans and the military codes that protected the project. And she fled in a small ship that she piloted herself. And she did not stop running until she reached Earth. Admiral Vasquez met her at the landing pad. And the two females stood face to face, one human and one Valorian. And between them lay the future of two civilizations. "Why did you come here?" Vasquez asked. And her voice held neither hostility nor trust. Only careful evaluation. There held out a data crystal that contained everything she had stolen. And her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Because I watched the footage from Nova Helsinki 1,000 times, she said. And I saw something that I had never seen before. I saw ordinary people refuse to surrender, refuse to accept defeat, refuse to stop fighting, even when all logic said they should give up." She placed the crystal in Vasquez's hand and stepped back. "I want to be on the side that fights for something," Kethra continued. "Not the side that destroys, because it fears what it cannot control." Vasquez looked at the crystal and then at the alien who had brought it, and she made a decision that would change everything. "Welcome to humanity's side," she said. And she extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting and friendship. Thora took the hand, and in that moment, the war for the galaxy truly began. The data on the crystal revealed a weapon called the Silence of Worlds, a ship capable of destroying planets from a distance that made defense seemingly impossible. But Admiral Vasquez looked at the specifications and smiled, because she saw something the hegemony had not considered. "They think they can destroy us from orbit," she said to her gathered officers. "Safe from our reach, beyond the range of any weapon." She pulled up images of human history on the display, of arrows and bullets and missiles that had crossed impossible distances to hit their targets. "They have forgotten who we are," she continued. "They have forgotten that distance has never stopped us. That humans put a projectile on the moon from 384,000 kilometers away. And we did it for science, for curiosity, for the simple joy of hitting something very far away." She turned to face her officers, and her eyes burned with determination. "Prepare the fleet," Admiral Vasquez ordered. "We have a planet killer to destroy and a galaxy to save." The Silence of Worlds launched from hegemony space on a clear morning. Surrounded by the largest fleet ever assembled in galactic history, and its destination was Earth. And its mission was extinction. 3,000 warships formed a protective shell around the planet Killer, their weapons ready to destroy anything that approached, their shields capable of withstanding any conventional attack. The High Council watched from their throne world with satisfaction, certain that victory was finally within their grasp, certain that the human problem would soon be solved forever. They had learned nothing from Nova Helsinki, and that ignorance would cost them everything. Admiral Vasquez commanded humanity's response from the bridge of the carrier Persistence, and her fleet was small compared to the hegemony armada, but size had never been what made humans dangerous. All pilots, report status, she ordered, and across the fleet, thousands of voices responded. The human plan was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, because it relied not on massive warships or overwhelming firepower, but on something far simpler and far more terrifying. Each human pilot flew a small craft barely larger than a fighter, and each craft carried a single weapon, a rail-accelerated kinetic projectile guided by the most sophisticated targeting system in the galaxy. Human eyes and human hands. The projectiles were simple tungsten rods, dense and heavy and moving at speeds that made shields irrelevant, and each one was aimed not at the silence of worlds itself, but at the tiny vulnerabilities that every ship possessed: exhaust ports and sensor gaps and maintenance hatches, openings so small that hitting them should have been impossible. But humans had been hitting impossible targets since the first cave dweller threw a rock at a running rabbit. The hegemony fleet detected the approaching human craft and dismissed them as a nuisance. Too small to carry significant weapons, too few to threaten 3,000 warships. They were wrong. The human pilots spread across the battlefield like stars scattering across the sky, each one finding their position, each one calculating their shot, each one waiting for the signal that would begin the end. Admiral Vasquez watched the tactical display and saw the pieces falling into place. And she thought of Maria Santos throwing a fork across a conference room. And she thought of Anders Lindquist fighting from a wheelchair. And she thought of all the ordinary humans who had refused to be defeated. All pilots, she said, her voice calm and steady. Fire at will. The galaxy had never seen anything like what happened next. Thousands of tungsten rods launched simultaneously, each one traveling at a fraction of the speed of light. Each one guided by a human who had spent their entire life practicing for this moment. The hegemony defensive systems tried to intercept them, but the rods were too small and too fast, and they slipped through the defenses like needles through cloth. The first rod struck the silence of worlds through an exhaust port no larger than a human fist, and it traveled through the ship's interior and destroyed a critical power conduit. The second rod struck a sensor array that controlled the main weapon systems, and the third struck the navigation computer, and the fourth and fifth and 100th rods struck targets that the hegemony had thought were impossible to hit. The silence of worlds died not in a massive explosion, but in a cascade of small failures, each one caused by a single projectile that had found its mark with perfect precision. The hegemony fleet tried to respond, but the human pilots were already moving, already calculating their next shots, already targeting the warships that had thought themselves invincible. Captain Yuki Tanaka was 22 years old now, and she had been 12 when she first showed Commander Vasquez her shooting skills on Nova Helsinki, and her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind as she lined up her shot. "Hit what you aim at," he had told her, "because you never know when it might matter." A rod punched through the bridge of a hegemony cruiser and killed its entire command staff in a single heartbeat across the battlefield. Similar stories played out thousands of times. Human pilots finding impossible shots and taking them without hesitation, their hands steady and their eyes clear and their aim true. The hegemony fleet broke within hours, their formation shattered, their flagship destroyed. Their planet killer reduced to drifting wreckage, Admiral Vasquez watched the retreat and felt no joy. Only exhaustion and relief, and the weight of everything that had been lost to reach this moment. All pilots. "Cease fire," she ordered. "Let them go." Some of her officers protested, arguing that the hegemony should be pursued and destroyed completely. But Vasquez shook her head. "We are not conquerors," she said. "We are defenders." And the defense is complete. The war did not end in that moment. But its conclusion became inevitable. The Hegemony High Council watched the footage of their fleet's destruction, and they saw something that terrified them to their core. Thousands of impossible shots, hitting thousands of impossible targets, executed by pilots who had learned to throw before they could walk. They sued for peace within a week, and the terms they accepted would have been unthinkable before Nova Helsinki. Humanity would be recognized as equals in the galactic community, and the hegemony would withdraw from all contested territories, and most importantly, any species that wished to leave hegemony control would be allowed to do so. The Krix were the first to declare independence, and human instructors arrived on their world within days to begin teaching them the skills that had saved Earth. Other species followed, and across the galaxy, sporting clubs opened where humans taught the arts of accuracy and precision. Throwing and shooting and hitting what you aimed at. Admiral Vasquez retired from active service 5 years after the war, and she spent her final years writing a history of the conflict that would be studied for generations. But before she left the military, she made one final trip to Kepler Station to visit a cafeteria that had become famous across 12 star systems. Maria Santos was 73 now, and she still made the best soup on the station. And she still had the arm that had started everything when Vasquez walked into the cafeteria. She found Maria teaching a young Krix refugee how to throw darts, adjusting the insectoid's grip and stance with patient instruction. "You started all this," Vasquez said. Watching the Krix hit the target for the first time, Maria shrugged, and her weathered face creased in a familiar smile. "I just did not want my soup to get cold," she replied. "The ambassador's guards were taking too long to react, and I had meals to serve," Vasquez laughed. And the sound echoed through the cafeteria like music. "The galaxy will never forget what you did," she said. Maria turned back to her student, guiding another throw, watching as the dart struck true. "The galaxy does not need to remember me," Maria said. "It just needs to remember the lesson. Never threaten someone who grew up throwing things." The Krix student threw another dart, and this one hit the center of the target. And Maria clapped her hands in approval. "Very good," she said. "Keep practicing, and soon you will throw like you were born to do it." Across the galaxy, a new saying had taken hold, repeated in 100 languages on 1,000 worlds. A warning and a promise and a statement of simple truth: never threaten a human, because they all throw like they mean it. And they do not miss. The stars had once seemed cold and empty and full of danger, but now they were full of possibility, full of species learning to stand tall and fight for their freedom. And at the center of it all stood humanity, a species of natural-born marksmen who had turned a cafeteria worker's thrown fork into a revolution that changed everything. The galaxy would never be the same, and that was exactly as it should be.